Good morning. I'm Tamala Edwards. Welcome to Inside Story. This morning on a special edition, we're talking about structural racism and the media. And we have an old friend, an insider, and someone who knows a lot about this topic, Larry Platt, the editor-in-chief of the Philadelphia Citizen. I miss you at the table, but I'm still glad to get to talk to you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me and for giving me this reason to shower.
Anytime. Well, you have just written a piece on this for the Citizen, and Larry, it feels like we're dealing with two things. We're dealing with decisions that people have made in this moment, like Stan Wachowski at the Inquirer stepping down over a headline, Buildings Matter Too, which of course seemed to be a rebuttal to Black Lives Matter, and a furor that happened there at the newspaper, but also in the industry, a larger truth-telling. Staffers, black staffers coming forward, especially as companies were saying we stand with Black Lives Matter, to say, well, that's not what happened when I was there. And they talk about pay disparities, obstacles to advancement, racist comments and behaviors, retaliation, and just plain ignorance. And some of the people caught up in this, we're talking Anna Wintour at Condé Nast, at Vogue, who has had to answer for some things, Dan Rappaport, who had been the editor of Bon Appetit, this piece from the New York Times about him resigning over pictures of himself in brownface and the way that he treated staffers. Editors have also stepped down at a lot of websites, Man Repeller, Refinery 29, Who, What, Where, some other sites. I mean, this seems to be a big, deep problem set up for us. What is going on here, just how big and deep indeed it is.
Well, I think you use the word reckoning, which I think it is. And I think it is this type of introspection and correction is long overdue, and the kind of thing that is vital in the mess that is democracy. There is so much to unpack in terms of media and race. Among them is the sordid history. You mentioned the piece I wrote. I talked to Eric Deggans, an NPR media critic, who sort of walked me through the history of newspapers not only not covering the civil rights movement, but being pawns of the status quo during the civil rights movement. And many newspapers have had to since apologize for that. So the conversation that we're seeing now in newsrooms is a good thing if it ends up being a doubling down on storytelling as the answer. In other words, let's use the First Amendment. The press is the one industry given First Amendment protection. Use the First Amendment to tell everyone's story. And the reporters who sort of walked out after the Buildings Matter headline at the Inquirer sort of said this in their letter. They said that we have to go into communities of color, and when you only show up for a fire or a murder, you lack credibility. And there is the kernel of real substantive reform in that critique, I think.
It's interesting you talked about that point. I was reminded of a tweet thread by someone who had been a senior editor at Philadelphia Magazine. I believe Fabiola Saris is the way to say her name. And she talked about a conversation with an Inquirer reporter, both of them black, in tears, noting that people were showing up in this moment of social unrest yet again to talk about black pain. But we're not there in these communities to show these people as people with full lives, as parents, as workers, as individuals, and how that even impacted in this moment, how people understand the story.
Yeah, this is sort of in a way as old as our history. You go back and read W.E.B. Du Bois, who talks about the duality that African Americans are made to live their lives with, and I think largely older white male editors, mea culpa on this front, have often asked more of African American reporters in newsrooms. We've asked them to sort of exist on that duality platform, to put their blackness away almost. And I would be lying if I told you that this moment didn't cause a certain amount of introspection on my part, because as I said in the piece, it makes me wonder if we're all guys like me, Branch Rickeys and Jackie Robinson, has suddenly gotten fed up of turning the other cheek. We've asked African American reporters, under the guise of objectivity, which I think is a invented tenet of fiction, under the guise of objectivity, to not bring their full humanity to their work. How do you do that? You can't. And I think one of the reforms that come out of this moment, I hope, is turning loose everyone's voice, point of view, as opposed to journalism as stenography.
But isn't part of the problem also when we talk about the bias, a decision on who has value? That, there's an old saying about our business that we are meant to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, but so often certain groups are seen as more important and having more important stories to tell. And some of it's just laziness. A good writer, a good editor can make a story about anyone, anywhere, a compelling story, but that doesn't happen if you say that person's story has as much value as that wealthy person's story.
Absolutely. The decisions about what you cover and where flow out of the life experiences of those who are making the decisions. That's why the whole thing is subjective. So the notion that journalism is some sort of objective exercise, it's subjective from the very beginning. Think about if I'm writing a story and I interview someone for an hour and I use one quote, that's a subjective judgment. And it's a subjective judgment that flows from my predisposition, from my life, from my experience. My view is to say to all writers, whatever color or creed, go out, still report, arbitrate between competing sets of ideologies, but become an expert and tell us what you think. Be transparent. I don't believe that news consumers are turned off by bias so much as they're turned off by the denial of bias, which is what journalism has been doing all these years.
One of the things that we're seeing, and you point this out in your piece, is everyone's rushing to say, I hired some black people. We've seen in the past, a million groups are created, mentorships, hires, but hiring is not the same as people thriving and making their way up the ladder to truly affect the culture and changes within an organization. In fact, Philly Mag, you're seeing an article, I believe, in just a moment from the Inquirer about Tom McGrath, the editor, stepping down, saying that changes need to come and that he didn't think a middle-aged white guy as himself was the one, you see the piece there from the Inquirer, was the person to do it. But the reality is that is a newsroom that has two black full-time writers. It is 92% white. Even if they hire a person of color, can they make the changes that are necessary to make that storied magazine move into the new age, to meet this moment, to be what it should be? And you were an editor there. You know the place well.
Right. Full disclosure, I was the editor there for almost 8 years. I think you need to go beyond. I think, yes, you need a full commitment to not only a diverse staff, but diversity in the room when and where decisions are being made. And so that means throughout the organization. That's the inclusion part. But I think it goes even beyond that. I think what media organizations have to do, well, one very practical thing that many have to do is look at the collective bargaining agreements, because many of them still have, and the Inquirer's made some headway on this, many of them still have the prescription that last hired is first out when there are layoffs. And so what you've seen over the last couple of decades is the more diverse young hires getting laid off left and right throughout the country because of those collective bargaining agreements. So in the same way we talk about police reform needing to involve union reform, you need to address that in when it comes to newspapers and collective bargaining. So I think it's it's a mind shift that has to take place, especially in mainstream media, and in the for-profit media realm, where you get rewarded for clicks. And so sometimes in that realm, as opposed to the nonprofit sector where I am now, um, you are much less incentivized to think in terms of the long-term health of society.
Let's talk about something else you brought up in your piece. James Bennett, the former opinion editor at the New York Times, was forced out over an article by Senator Tom Cotton, who said that they should invoke the Insurrection Act to turn the troops loose on the protesters. You see the piece there from the New York Times. That was the piece, Send in the Troops. James got torn up in part because it turned out he hadn't read the piece, but black staffers there said this imperils us and every black person out there who's already dealing with brutality from the police and others to say turn the troops loose on them. After his resignation, there was an argument on the other side that said that wasn't the right thing to do. You should have run an opposing essay. Ask Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, anybody who had an opposite point of view to write an essay and put it out there for people to argue about. In fact, there are black journalists who've said that's how this should have been handled. Wanted to get your view as we go forward, because you don't want censorship on one side, but not on the other side as well. How do we get to a place where voices are being heard, but we're making the right decision to have a more fulsome discussion and to set a standard of what should and should not be run?
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. That was a horrible decision to back off from the publishing of a United States senator's op-ed. This is an op-ed page that has published op-eds from Vladimir Putin, just to be clear. So the idea that a U.S. senator can't express an opinion that we may disagree with, but that is what democracy is all about. That is why that First Amendment protection was given to the free press, because the marketplace of ideas is about the collision of competing ideas. And we can't get to a place where we're only publishing safe opinions that the rank and file agree with. That would be a very dangerous proposition. In that instance, what's happening ultimately is everyone becomes Fox News. It becomes journalism by ideology and not the collision of ideas, which sometimes will offend people. But I think, and I've argued my whole life, that as horrible as our history is, as atrocious as our original sin is, the genius of the American experiment is that we have this priority carved out for the competition of ideas, for freedom of speech. We need more speech, more discourse, more disagreement, but less questioning of each other's motives. And that's where I come back to storytelling. If you can, what I would love to have seen the Inquirer do, and those reporters who wrote that wonderful letter, is to exercise their First Amendment rights and go out and cover the hell out of Philadelphia and race, and write about the Philadelphia Inquirer's history in the context of race. That's what the Washington Post did in 1981 when Janet Cook wrote a fraudulent series on and won a Pulitzer. Ben Bradley said, "You know what? We're an institution that needs covering like any other institution." And they wrote an 18,000-word investigation of themselves.
So take a look at what they've done.
And it enhanced their credibility.
There's so much more that we could talk about, but thank you for these 15 minutes. Got a lot out of it, and I think a lot of people watching what's going on with the media would be interested to see where we go from here. Do we see more voices at the table of color, of political persuasion, of otherwise, and does it get us to a better place? Hopefully soon. Thanks again, Larry, and one day I'll see you back at this table. And thank you for joining us here on Inside Story.